In 1968, a lone black climber stood at the base of Mount Everest. His name was Isaiah Zay Monroe, a man determined to defy not just gravity, but history. Days later, he vanished in a deadly storm. No trace, no body. For 15 years, his disappearance became legend, until one summer, a frozen body was found high on the mountain. Clutched in his hand, a journal, and in it, a final message. I saw a light that was not of this world. It beckoned me onward. What happened to Zay Monroe on that mountain, and what was the light he saw before he died? The ice gleamed blue in the weak morning light as Mi'kmaq Sherpa's pickaxe struck the surface, sending crystalline shards cascading down the narrow ledge. June 1983. Unusually clear weather had opened a rare window for the Sherpa team to explore this seldom traversed section of Everest's North Ridge. They were blazing a new route, one that would avoid the increasingly treacherous avalanche zones below. "Dorje, come quickly!" Mi'kmaq's voice cut through the thin air, betraying an emotion rarely heard from the veteran mountain guide. Dorje scrambled across the narrow ice shelf, his crampons biting into the ancient ice. He stopped abruptly, breath catching in his throat. There, emerging from the translucent blue ice, was a human hand. Not the completely desiccated, blackened appendage typical of Everest's victims, but a hand remarkably preserved, still wearing a faded red glove. Working with careful precision, they cleared away more ice, revealing a body in a sitting position, back against the mountain face. The man's features were largely intact, dark skin preserved by 15 years of sub-zero temperatures. His expression appeared peaceful, though time had subtly altered his appearance. A slight hollowing of the cheeks, skin drawn taut across his features. "Impossible," Dorje whispered. "How could anyone reach this ledge? There is no path." Clutched in the frozen fingers was a leather-bound journal, and tucked between its pages, a photograph. Mi'kmaq extracted it carefully, holding it up to the morning light. The photograph showed the same man standing on an Everest ridge, smiling triumphantly. But what made Mi'kmaq's blood run cold was what surrounded him, a strange, luminous aura that encircled his figure like a halo of light that couldn't be explained by sun or snow. The initials stitched on the man's jacket confirmed what the Sherpas already suspected. They had found Isaiah Zay Monroe, the solo black climber who had vanished without a trace in 1968, whose disappearance had become mountaineering legend. But the photograph in his hand suggested his story was far more mysterious than anyone had imagined. If you enjoy fictional mysteries like this one, hit subscribe and comment where you're watching from. You won't want to miss what happened to Isaiah Monroe and the chilling discovery that defies explanation. Isaiah Monroe was born with his eyes fixed on the sky. Even as a baby, his mother Ruth would find him staring upward, tiny hands reaching for something beyond their cramped wooden house in Birmingham, Alabama. It was 1935, and for a black child in the segregated South, even the sky seemed like forbidden territory. His father, James, was a sharecropper who returned home each evening with soil embedded in the creases of his hands, his back bent from labor, but never his spirit. "The white man owns the land," he would tell young Zay, "but nobody owns the sky. Remember that, son? Nobody owns the heights." Those words became Zay's mantra during a childhood where no colored allowed signs restricted his movements, but never his dreams. While other children played in dusty yards, Zay climbed. First trees, then the rocky outcroppings beyond town. His mother would scold him, terrified he'd fall, but James would wink at his son across the dinner table. "That boy's got the spirit of the eagle," he'd say proudly. "He's meant for higher places." By 13, Zay had scaled every climbable surface within walking distance of his home. He'd disappear for hours, returning with scraped knees and a peculiar light in his eyes that worried Ruth but reassured James. "When I'm up high," he told his father once, "the world below stops mattering. Up there, I'm just a man touching the sky, not a colored boy, just me." The year Zay turned 20, Birmingham erupted in violence. Civil rights marchers clashed with police, and the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church killed 4 little girls not much younger than his sister Lila. The message was clear. Birmingham held no future for a young black man with ambitions beyond the cotton fields. Chicago beckoned with promises of jobs, opportunity, and maybe a little less hatred. Zay arrived with $40 in his pocket, his father's pocket knife, and a dog-eared copy of National Geographic featuring an article on the first American expedition to Mount Everest. "I'll be back," he'd promised Lila, then just 15 and devastated by her brother's departure. "I'll climb mountains you've never even heard of, and I'll come back with stories that'll make your head spin." Chicago proved both salvation and curse. He found work as a janitor at the University of Chicago, where he'd slip into geology lectures during breaks, absorbing knowledge about rock formations and mountain ranges. By night, he'd pore over climbing books in the public library, memorizing techniques and equipment he couldn't afford. The breakthrough came in 1958, when he met Harold "Hal" Thompson, a geology professor and weekend climber who found Zay studying mountaineering books with an intensity that caught his attention. "You climb?" Hal had asked, surprised. "Not yet," Zay had answered honestly, "but I will." Something in his certainty moved the older white man. Despite the raised eyebrows and whispered comments, Hal took Zay under his wing. He lent him equipment, snuck him into the university's climbing gym after hours, and eventually took him on weekend trips to nearby crags and rock faces. "You've got natural talent," Hal told him after watching Zay navigate a particularly difficult route. "But more importantly, you've got the head for it. Climbing is 90% mental, and your mind is like steel." Through Hal, Zay connected with a small network of climbers who valued skill over skin color. By 1963, he'd summited peaks in Colorado and California, earning a quiet reputation as a methodical, fearless climber. But newspaper coverage of his achievements was non-existent. When white climbers conquered peaks, their faces appeared in magazines. Zay's accomplishments remained invisible to all but a select few. His letters home to Lila grew more philosophical with each climb. "There's a freedom on the mountain that I can't explain," he wrote. "When I'm hanging by my fingertips above a 1,000-foot drop, nobody cares about the color of those fingertips. The mountain doesn't discriminate. It tries to kill everyone equally." In 1966, Zay received devastating news. His father had collapsed in the fields, his heart giving out under the Alabama sun. He returned home for the funeral, finding Ruth withdrawn with grief and Lila transformed into a poised young woman active in civil rights work. Standing beside his father's grave, Zay made a silent promise. James Monroe had never gotten to rise above the cotton fields that bent his back, but his son would touch the highest point on earth. He would claim the summit that even privileged white men feared. Everest became more than a mountain. It became a symbol of every barrier that had ever been placed before him, every door that had been closed in his face, every "no colored allowed" sign that had limited his world. His journal entries from this period reveal a man increasingly focused on a singular goal. "If I can stand on top of the world," he wrote, "maybe I can prove that we belong everywhere, even places we've been told aren't for us. What drives someone to risk everything for an impossible dream? Share your thoughts below." By 1967, Zay had attempted to join 3 separate Everest expeditions. Each time his application was rejected with polite excuses that never quite mentioned his race but hinted at team dynamics and public relations considerations. The message was clear. America wasn't ready for a black man on its Everest teams. If Zay was going to climb the mountain, he would have to do it alone. The apartment walls disappeared beneath maps, weather charts, and technical diagrams. Zay's tiny Chicago flat became a war room for his assault on Everest. While official expeditions had corporate sponsorships and teams of planners, Zay had determination and a stack of library books. "You're out of your mind," Hal told him over coffee in January 1967. "Nobody climbs Everest alone. Even with oxygen, Sherpa support, and perfect conditions, the mountain kills half the people who try." Zay just smiled. "Then I'll be the first." His preparation was methodical, bordering on obsessive. Every penny from his janitor's salary that didn't go to rent went into a coffee can labeled Everest. He worked night shifts at a factory, afternoon shifts at the university, sleeping just 4 hours a day. Physical training became his religion. With no money for a gym membership, he filled a backpack with books and ran stadium stairs. He slept with the windows open during Chicago's brutal winter to acclimate his body to cold. On weekends, he'd hitchhike to Wisconsin's modest peaks, testing himself against increasingly harsh conditions. The biggest challenge was equipment. Top-quality climbing gear was prohibitively expensive, and Everest required the best. Hal donated what he could: an old but reliable ice axe, crampons that needed sharpening, a down jacket from a previous expedition. Other climbers from their small circle contributed pieces of gear, moved by Zay's determination. The oxygen system posed the greatest problem. Standard systems were heavy and inefficient. Zay spent months modifying a used system, reducing its weight and increasing its efficiency. He tested it in a pressure chamber at the university, sneaking in after hours with Hal's reluctant help. "If this fails at 28,000 feet, you'll be dead before you know it," Hal warned. "If I don't try, I'll die slower, but just as surely," Zay replied. By December 1967, the coffee can held enough for a one-way ticket to Kathmandu and minimal expenses. There would be no margin for error, no rescue option. Zay knew the statistics. Nearly 1 in 4 climbers died on Everest. For a solo climber with minimal equipment and no support, the odds were significantly worse. His last night in Chicago, Hal hosted a small gathering of the climbers who had supported Zay's journey. They drank whiskey and shared stories, the elephant in the room growing larger as the night progressed, the very real possibility that they were saying goodbye forever. As Zay was leaving, Hal pressed a small radio transmitter into his hand. "It's military surplus," he explained. "Battery life is short, but it might save your life. Promise you'll use it if things go bad." The journey to Lila's apartment the next morning was heavier. At 27, she had become a force in her own right, working with the SCLC and organizing voter registration drives. Her eyes, so like their father's, filled with tears as they said goodbye. "This isn't just about climbing, is it?" she asked. Zay considered lying, then decided against it. "It's about proving something." "To who?" "White people who don't care if you live or die." "To every black kid who's been told to lower their gaze." He squeezed her hand. "And maybe a little bit to Dad." She pressed a small object into his palm, their father's pocket knife, worn smooth from years of use. "Then come back and tell those kids yourself," she whispered. Spring 1968 found Zay in Nepal, a solitary figure at Everest Base Camp. The other expeditions viewed him with a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and concern. A black American attempting Everest solo was unprecedented, possibly suicidal. A Swiss team leader approached him on his second day. "You understand the mountain kills even the best-equipped teams," he said, not unkindly. "What you're attempting." "I understand," Zay cut him off. "I'm not asking for help." "Nevertheless," the Swiss climber continued, "if you find yourself in trouble near our route, we will not leave you to die." It was the closest thing to support Zay would receive. The Khumbu Icefall loomed above base camp, a chaotic maze of ice blocks the size of houses, constantly shifting and breaking apart. Many climbers considered it Everest's most dangerous section. Expeditions typically navigated it with fixed ropes and aluminum ladders, crossing gaping crevasses in the pre-dawn hours when the ice was most stable. Zay tackled it alone, setting out at 3 a.m. on April 23rd. Other climbers watched through binoculars as his headlamp traced a wavering path upward. Many expected to witness a tragedy. 6 hours later, he emerged at the top of the icefall, establishing his Camp 1 at 19,500 feet. He activated his radio briefly. "Monroe at Camp Y," he reported to base camp. "Icefall secure." The terse message masked an ordeal that had nearly killed him twice. Once when a snow bridge collapsed seconds after he crossed it, and again when an ice block the size of a car shifted just feet away. But he had made it, and the Swiss team leader, who had been monitoring his progress, grudgingly noted in his journal that night, "The American may not be as foolish as he appears." If you're captivated by mysteries like this one, be sure to hit subscribe and leave us a comment below telling us where you're watching from. The climb to Camp 2 took another 3 days. Zay moved slowly, methodically, conserving energy and acclimatizing to the altitude. The western CUM stretched before him, a vast valley of ice flanked by Everest on one side and Lhotse on the other. Temperatures swung wildly, broiling under the reflected sun during the day, plummeting well below zero at night. His journal entries from this period reveal a man increasingly attuned to the mountain's moods. April 26th. The mountain breathes, not metaphorically, but literally. I can feel it expanding and contracting beneath me. The ice groans at night like it's telling secrets. I'm learning its language slowly. Camp 3 at 24,000 feet marked the beginning of the death zone, the altitude at which the human body begins to deteriorate. Oxygen levels are a third of those at sea level. The brain swells, the lungs fill with fluid, and simple tasks become monumental challenges. Zay's radio transmissions, once practical and concise, grew more philosophical. "Monroe at Camp 3. The air is so thin here, I can see through it to something beyond. Last night I dreamed I was talking to Dad on the summit. He said he was proud. The strangest thing, when I woke, there was light in my tent, but no source I could find." The Swiss team leader, monitoring these transmissions, exchanged concerned glances with his team doctor. "Altitude sickness," the doctor suggested. "Hallucinations are common above 24,000 feet. "Perhaps," the leader agreed, though something in Zay's calm, clear voice belied simple oxygen deprivation. On May 2nd, Zay established Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, his final camp before the summit push. From here, climbers typically made their final assault, timing their summit bid to reach the top in late morning and return to camp before dark. Zay's plan was similar, but with one critical difference. He would need to carry his oxygen system with him rather than caching spare tanks along the route, as larger expeditions did. If anything failed, there would be no backup. His radio crackled to life one last time on the evening of May 2nd. "Monroe at Camp 4. Summit attempt begins at midnight. Weather looks stable, but there's something strange about the sky tonight. Stars seem closer than they should be. There are lights on the ridge above that move in patterns, not headlamps. Something else." The Swiss leader frowned. "What's the forecast for the summit tomorrow?" Their meteorologist shook his head. "Clear until afternoon. Then a system moving in. He should have time if he moves quickly." "And these lights he mentioned?" "Temperature inversions can cause strange reflections or altitude-induced hallucinations." The leader nodded, but made a note to have their high camp team keep watch for the solo climber's headlamp the following day. At 12:15 a.m. on May 3rd, 1968, Zay stepped out of his tent into the crystalline night. Everest's summit loomed 3,000 feet above him, a dark triangle against the star-filled sky. The silence was absolute, broken only by his breathing and the crunch of crampons on ice. He paused, looking up at the immense face before him. In his journal, recovered 15 years later, he wrote what would be his final entry. "The night has eyes. I can feel them watching me. Dad used to say that courage isn't about not being afraid, it's about being terrified and taking the next step anyway. The summit ridge is outlined in a blue glow that no climber has ever mentioned. I'm going to follow it and see where it leads." With that, Isaiah Munro began his final climb into history and mystery. The storm hit with apocalyptic fury. What had been clear, cold air at midnight transformed into a howling maelstrom by dawn. Winds exceeding 100 miles per hour ripped across Everest's upper slopes, driving snow and ice horizontally with enough force to strip exposed skin from bone. At base camp, the Swiss team huddled in their communications tent, listening to static-filled radio reports from their Camp 2 team. No one had seen the American's headlamp. No one had any idea where he might be. At 8:37 a.m., through the roaring static, a single transmission broke through. "Munro, holding position. Storm. Not natural." The radio operator adjusted dials frantically, trying to clear the signal. "Say again, Mr. Munro, what is your position?" The voice that responded was eerily calm despite the obvious strain. "Holding on." "Storm came fast. If this is my last word, remember, I reached for the horizon." Then, almost as an afterthought, "There's a light that isn't, it's opening somehow. I think I should." Static swallowed the rest. Despite repeated attempts, no further transmissions were received. The storm raged for 3 days, pinning down every expedition on the mountain. When it finally cleared on May 6th, the Swiss team immediately dispatched their strongest climbers to search for the missing American. They found his Camp 4 site in ruins. The tent had been shredded by the wind, its aluminum poles bent like straws. Equipment lay scattered across 50 yards of snow and ice. Most disturbing were the footprints, a single set leading away from the camp, heading not toward the summit route, but off to the east, toward a section of the mountain considered impassable. The tracks continued for nearly a quarter mile before vanishing at the edge of a sheer drop. Below lay thousands of feet of near-vertical ice and rock. No human could survive such a fall. The search team photographed the site, collected what personal effects they could find, and made the grim descent to base camp. The expedition leader filed the official report that evening. American climber Isaiah Munro, attempting solo ascent, presumed dead after equipment failure and exposure during unexpected storm. Body unrecoverable. Personal effects will be returned to next of kin. The report was clinical, matter of fact. What it didn't mention were the searchers' conflicted accounts of the footprints, how they seemed unnaturally even and deliberate for someone caught in a blizzard, how they headed purposefully toward a section no rational climber would approach, how they ended not in signs of a fall or struggle, but simply stopped, as if their maker had been plucked from the mountain. News of Zay's disappearance reached Chicago 2 days later. Hal Thompson received the telegram while grading papers in his office. His hands shook as he read it, then reached for the phone to make the hardest call of his life. In Birmingham, Lila was organizing voter registration cards when the phone rang. The moment she heard Hal's voice, she knew there was no outburst, no collapse, just a quiet "I see" and a question. Did they find his body? No, Hal admitted. The mountain kept him. That evening, Lila sat alone in her apartment, surrounded by her brother's letters. She removed their father's pocketknife from its envelope, the one possession of Zay's that hadn't gone to the mountain with him. As she turned it over in her hands, she made a promise. "This isn't over, Zay," she whispered. "I won't let them forget you." The American press barely noted the disappearance. A 3-paragraph piece on page 12 of the Chicago Tribune mentioned local janitor I. Munro lost on unauthorized Everest attempt. The mountaineering journals were only slightly more detailed, categorizing his death as inevitable given the reckless nature of the attempt. But in Sherpa villages throughout the Khumbu region, the story took on different dimensions. Sherpas, who had observed Zay during his brief time at base camp, spoke of his quiet dignity, his respectful demeanor, and the fact that he had attempted the mountain not as a conqueror, but as a supplicant. More intriguing were the accounts that emerged from those who had been high on the mountain during the storm. 3 Sherpas from a Japanese expedition reported seeing lights moving on the North Ridge during the worst of the blizzard, lights that followed no climbing route and moved too quickly to be human climbers. A British expedition member, descending in the storm's aftermath, claimed to have heard a voice on the wind that spoke words he couldn't understand, but felt compelled to follow. His teammates had physically restrained him from wandering off the fixed ropes toward the same eastern face where Zay's footprints had led. These stories might have remained isolated incidents if not for a photograph taken by the Japanese team's summit party 3 weeks after Zay's disappearance. Intended to document their successful ascent, the image instead captured something unexplainable in the background, a dark figure standing on a ridge where no climber could possibly be, surrounded by what appeared to be a luminous blue aura. Photographic experts would later determine the image hadn't been tampered with, while simultaneously being unable to explain what it showed. The Japanese team had not edited their film, yet what appeared on it defied rational explanation. What do you think happened to Zay in those final moments? Share your theories below. Lila received a small box of her brother's recovered possessions that June. It contained his backup glasses, a few pages from his journal that had been found near the tent, and a small stone he had collected from the Khumbu icefall, wrapped in a scrap of paper with "First Step" written on it. What it didn't contain were answers. The journal pages were mostly technical notes about oxygen consumption and weather patterns. Nothing explained the strange lights he had reported, his odd final transmission, or why his footprints led where they did. In the absence of concrete information, the legend of Isaiah Munro began to grow. Some dismissed him as foolhardy, an amateur who had no business on Everest. Others portrayed him as a civil rights statement, a black man literally climbing above America's racial boundaries. But among those who knew the mountain best, a different narrative emerged. Sherpa guides began telling stories of the American who walks between worlds, a solitary figure occasionally glimpsed in the most dangerous sections of the mountain, appearing during storms to guide lost climbers back to safety. Several climbers, disoriented in whiteouts or suffering from oxygen deprivation, reported being led to safety by a dark-skinned man who appeared suddenly on the mountain and vanished just as mysteriously once they reached secure ground. When shown photographs of various climbers, they invariably pointed to Zay's image, despite having no way of knowing who he was. By the early 1970s, references to the Guardian of the North Ridge had become common enough that the Alpine Journal published a scholarly article attempting to explain the phenomenon through the psychological effects of high altitude. The author concluded that oxygen deprivation, combined with the power of suggestion, could account for the sightings. What it couldn't explain was the light. Every account, whether from Western climbers or Sherpa guides, mentioned the same detail, a blue-white luminescence that surrounded the figure, distinct from moonlight or headlamps, with an almost liquid quality as it moved through the darkness. Lila collected these stories meticulously, creating a file that grew thicker with each passing year. She corresponded with climbers, interviewed expedition members, and pored over photographs, looking for evidence of her brother's fate. "I don't believe in ghosts," she told a reporter in 1972 when an article about Everest legends mentioned Zay's story. "But I do believe my brother found something on that mountain, something he was looking for his whole life." The years after Zay's disappearance transformed Lila Munro in ways no one could have predicted. The shy sister who had begged her brother not to leave became a woman obsessed with finding the truth about his fate. She converted her small Birmingham apartment into what her friends jokingly called the Monroe Archive. Maps of Everest covered the walls, with colored pins marking reported sightings of the mysterious figure. Filing cabinets held meticulously organized expedition reports, witness statements, and weather data from May 1968. Her mother Ruth, already bent with grief after losing her husband and son, watched with growing concern as Lila poured her life savings into this obsession. "You're chasing ghosts," she told her daughter. "Let him rest." But Lila couldn't rest, not when climbers continued to report encounters with a figure that matched her brother's description, not when each account contained details only Zay would know. In 1973, using money from her job as a school teacher, she made her first journey to Nepal. The trip nearly killed her. Altitude sickness at base camp confined her to a tent for 3 days, but she persisted, interviewing every Sherpa and climber willing to speak with her. What she found both comforted and disturbed her. The Sherpa community didn't view Zay as dead in the conventional sense. In their cosmology, certain souls remain connected to the places that claimed them, becoming part of the mountain's consciousness. "Your brother is not lost," an elderly Sherpa guide told her. "He has become something else, something between." Lila returned to America with more questions than answers, but also with a newfound purpose. If Zay's body would never be recovered, his story at least could be preserved. She began writing a book chronicling not just his final climb, but the barriers he had overcome throughout his life. The manuscript faced rejection after rejection. "Too niche," one publisher wrote. "Readers won't connect with a story about a Black Mountain climber." Another was more blunt. "The mystical elements undermine the biographical sections. Is this fact or fiction?" Undeterred, Lila self-published Higher Ground: The Isaiah Monroe Story in 1976. The small print run sold poorly outside climbing circles, but it achieved something more important. It established Zay's rightful place in mountaineering history. Copies found their way to climbing gyms and outdoor education programs. Young Black climbers discovered in Zay's story a predecessor they had never known existed. Letters began arriving at Lila's door from across the country. "I never knew someone who looked like me had stood on those heights. Your brother's story made me believe I could climb too. I carry his picture in my pack on every summit attempt." As America moved through the 1970s, the civil rights victories of the previous decade expanded representation in areas previously closed to Black Americans. In 1976, the same year Lila published her book, The Story of Charles Crenshaw, the first Black American to summit Denali in 1964, finally received national recognition. With each passing year, Lila made her pilgrimage to Nepal, adding to her collection of sightings and stories. The Monroe Light, as climbers had begun calling the phenomenon, was reported with increasing frequency, particularly during dangerous storms or in areas where climbers had become disoriented. In 1980, a Japanese climber in desperate straits, separated from his team during a whiteout, recorded a message on his dictaphone before his rescue. "There is someone approaching through the snow, a Black man. He is pointing the way down. There is light all around him, moving like water. I think I should follow." The climber was found the next day, half frozen but alive, at Camp 2, having navigated perfectly through the storm without a compass or visibility. When later shown photographs of various climbers, including Zay, he immediately identified him as his rescuer. If this story has kept you entertained, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more mysteries. By 1982, Lila's annual journeys to Everest had made her a familiar figure in the climbing community. Expedition teams would save their strange stories for her arrival, contributing to what had become the most comprehensive collection of Everest anomalies in existence. That year, a significant development occurred. An ambitious joint American-Nepalese expedition announced plans to establish a new route on Everest's North Ridge, specifically traversing the section where Zay's tracks had vanished 15 years earlier. The expedition leader, David Reichert, had read Lila's book and reached out to her during the planning stages. "We'll be passing through the exact area where your brother was last traced. If there's anything to find after all these years, we'll do our best to find it." Lila, now 47, and feeling the weight of her annual pilgrimages, responded with a handwritten note and a small package. "I've enclosed my brother's compass. He left it with me for safekeeping before his journey. It always points true. Perhaps it can guide you to him." In April 1983, the expedition established its base camp and began the slow process of acclimatization and route setting. Their plan involved creating a new path that avoided the increasingly dangerous Khumbu icefall, instead traversing a series of ice shelves on the less traveled north side. On June 17, 1983, a four-person team including two Sherpas, Mingma and Dorje, was setting fixed lines on a previously unexplored ice shelf when they made the discovery that would change everything. The radio crackled with static as David Reichert struggled to understand Mingma's excited voice. "Repeat your last transmission," he said, adjusting the dial on the base camp radio. "You found what?" The reply came through in broken phrases. "Body, remarkably preserved, Monroe. Must be Monroe." Reichert felt the hair rise on his arms, despite the Himalayan sun beating down on the communications tent. For 15 years, Isaiah Monroe had been a legend, a ghost story, a symbol. The idea that his body had been found and identified seemed impossible. "Are you absolutely certain?" he demanded. "How can you identify him after all this time?" "Initials on jacket." "I M," Mingma replied. "And sir, he has a journal and a photograph. You must see this photograph." Reichert dispatched the expedition's doctor and two additional Sherpas to the site immediately. He then faced the most difficult task, contacting Lila Monroe with news that would either bring closure or deeper mysteries. The satellite phone connection to Birmingham was tenuous, the words fragmenting across 8,000 miles of space. "Ms. Monroe," he said when her voice finally came through, "we found him. We found your brother." The silence lasted so long he thought they'd lost the connection. "How?" she finally asked, her voice unnaturally controlled. "Where?" "On an ice shelf on the North Ridge, an area that shouldn't be accessible from where he disappeared. He's remarkably preserved, though not perfectly. The extreme cold has protected him from the usual effects." Another long pause. "Is he intact?" "Yes. The cold. He looks like he could have died just a few years ago, not 15. "I'm coming," she said simply. "I'll be on the next flight to Kathmandu." 7,000 miles away, Dr. Eleanor Chen was conducting the most unusual examination of her career. The body of Isaiah Monroe lay in a hastily established snow cave that kept the remains at a stable temperature, preventing the decomposition that would begin rapidly if the body thawed. "This defies standard medical explanation," she told Reichert when he arrived with the additional team. "While there are clear signs of the passage of time, slight desiccation of the tissues, some cellular breakdown, the degree of preservation is extraordinary. Based on typical rates of deterioration at this altitude, I would expect far more damage after 15 years. "Could he have died more recently?" Reichert asked. The dating indicators are consistent with a 1968 death. But something about the conditions where he was found provided exceptional preservation. The body showed no signs of trauma, no broken bones, no lacerations, no frostbite damage. Isaiah Monroe appeared to have sat down on the ice shelf, closed his eyes, and simply stopped living. His expression was peaceful, almost content. More baffling was the location. The ice shelf where he was found had been surveyed multiple times since 1968. It was not near any established route, nor was it accessible from the area where his footprints had disappeared. For his body to be there, he would have had to navigate an impossible series of ice cliffs in the middle of a Category 5 storm. Maybe he was moved, suggested one of the Sherpas. Sometimes avalanches carry bodies great distances. Dr. Chen shook her head. There are no avalanche indicators, no trauma consistent with being swept down the mountain. And look at his position, perfectly seated, back against the ice wall. This is not where he fell. This is where he chose to be. The journal recovered from his hand provided both insights and deeper mysteries. Most pages contained standard expedition notes, oxygen levels, weather observations, technical details about equipment performance. But the final entries shifted in tone. May 1st, 1968. The air is different above Camp 3. Thinner, yes, but also charged somehow. Last night, I dreamed of Dad. He was standing on the summit surrounded by blue light, telling me he was proud. When I woke, that same light filled my tent for several seconds before fading. May 2nd, 1968. Established Camp 4 at 26,000 feet. Summit attempt begins at midnight. The stars seem closer than they should be. There are lights on the ridge above that move in patterns. Not headlamps. Something else. May 3rd, 1968. The night has eyes. I can feel them watching me. The summit ridge is outlined in a blue glow that no climber has ever mentioned. I'm going to follow it and see where it leads. The final entry was dated simply, after. Caught in the storm's embrace, saw a light that was not of this world. It beckoned me onward. If I do not return, let this chronicle remind you that I lived, I dared, I loved. Between the last two pages was the photograph that had caused Mingma's voice to shake during his radio transmission. It showed Zhe standing on a narrow ice ledge, backlit by an impossibly bright blue-white radiance that seemed to pour from the very rock behind him. His expression was one of wonder and revelation. Photo analysts would later confirm the image hadn't been manipulated. The film showed no signs of double exposure or light leaks. Whatever the camera had captured was physically present when the shutter opened. What do you think the mysterious light in Zhe's photograph really was? Let us know in the comments. When Lila Monroe arrived at base camp 8 days later, the expedition had established a security protocol around her brother's discovery. The body remained in the snow cave, preserved at sub-freezing temperatures, while the journal and photograph were kept in sealed containers to prevent degradation. Reichardt met her at the helicopter landing site, struck by the composure of this woman who had spent 15 years searching for answers about her brother's fate. "I need to see him," were her first words after disembarking, before anything else. The climb to the snow cave was arduous for someone unacclimatized to the altitude. Lila refused oxygen, pausing frequently to catch her breath, but never considering turning back. At the cave entrance, she hesitated for the first time. Does he look peaceful?" she asked. "Yes," Reichardt assured her, "like he's sleeping." The team had prepared her for the sight, explaining the unusual preservation, yet nothing could truly ready Lila for the moment she saw her brother's face, after 15 years. Despite the subtle signs of time, the slight hollowing of the cheeks, the leather-like quality of the skin, he was unmistakably Zhe. The same strong features, the same slight smile that had always played at the corners of his mouth when he was keeping a secret. She approached slowly, kneeling beside the body. With gloved hands, she gently touched his face, his shoulder, the fabric of his jacket. "It's really you," she whispered, "after all this time." For nearly an hour she sat with him in silence. The expedition team withdrew tactfully, giving her the privacy to say whatever needed saying. When she finally emerged from the cave, her eyes were dry, but her expression had shifted subtly. "I'd like to see the journal now," she said, "and the photograph." In the relative warmth of a heated tent, Reichardt carefully displayed the items recovered with Zay's body. Leila read the journal methodically, page by page, occasionally nodding as if confirming something she had long suspected. When she reached the photograph, she studied it without visible reaction for several minutes. "You know what this is, don't you?" Reichardt finally asked. "I've collected 15 years of stories about a light on the North Ridge," she replied evenly. "Climbers from a dozen countries have reported seeing it, always in the same area, always with the same quality. Some call it the Monroe Light. Others have their own names." "But what is it?" he persisted. Lila carefully returned the photograph to its protective sleeve. "My brother went to the mountain looking for something higher than himself. I think he found it." The recovery operation began the following day. Moving a body from 26,000 feet elevation presented enormous challenges. Helicopters couldn't operate at that altitude, meaning the team would need to manually transport the remains down to a point where airlift became possible. Complicating matters was Lila's insistence that her brother's body be treated with extraordinary care. "He doesn't just belong to me," she explained. "He's become important to a lot of people." The descent took 3 days, with teams of porters carefully transferring the preserved body down the mountain in a specially designed insulated transport case. At 14,000 feet, a high-altitude helicopter was able to complete the journey to Kathmandu. There, in a private laboratory, scientists conducted the examinations that would only deepen the mystery surrounding Isaiah Monroe's death and discovery. Carbon dating of tissue samples placed time of death between April and June 1968, confirming he had died during his expedition as presumed. Yet the body showed significantly less deterioration than expected for remains exposed to the elements for 15 years, even accounting for the preservative effects of extreme cold. More baffling were the readings from his equipment. His watch had stopped at 3:17 a.m. on May 3, 1968, presumably marking the moment of his death. Yet the mechanical movement showed minimal corrosion, as if it had been somehow protected from the elements. The oxygen system found with his body contained a substantial oxygen supply. Approximately 75% of its capacity remained. For a system designed to last 12 to 14 hours at high altitude, this was puzzling. Experts noted that even if Zay hadn't used it much before his death, the systems typically leaked over time, especially when exposed to extreme conditions. Finding one still pressurized after 15 years defied technical explanation. Most puzzling of all was the location. Extensive mapping confirmed what the expedition team had initially reported. The ice shelf where Zay was found had not existed in 1968. Geological surveys and historical photographs showed the area had been a sheer ice cliff until approximately 1973, when a major seismic event had created the shelf. "He couldn't have been there all these years," Dr. Chen explained to Lila. "The location where we found him didn't exist when he disappeared." "Then how did he get there?" Lila asked. The scientist hesitated. "We can't explain it, not with current science." As news of the discovery spread through the mountaineering community, those who had reported encounters with the mysterious figure on the North Ridge came forward with new details. A French climber who claimed to have been guided to safety during a 1976 storm provided a photograph showing a distant figure surrounded by blue light. When digitally enhanced and compared to Zay's summit photograph, the similarity was undeniable. A Sherpa guide who had worked on Everest for 30 years described repeated sightings of the American who walks between worlds, always near the area where Zay's body was ultimately found, always surrounded by the distinctive luminescence. "He is not a ghost," the guide insisted. "He is something else, something between worlds. On a crisp autumn day in 1983, Isaiah Zay Monroe was laid to rest in Birmingham, Alabama, beside his father's grave. The funeral brought together an unlikely assembly: aging civil rights activists, university professors, international climbers, and a contingent of Sherpa guides who had traveled from Nepal for the ceremony. The burial combined traditional elements with mountaineering rituals. Lila had arranged for small stones from Everest Base Camp to be placed in the grave, along with his father's pocket knife and a copy of his journal, now published as Higher Than Heaven, The Isaiah Monroe Story. The book became an unexpected bestseller, introducing Zay's story to a generation who had never heard of the black climber who had attempted Everest solo in 1968. The mystery surrounding his death and discovery only heightened public fascination. Scientists continued to study the evidence, offering theories ranging from unknown preservation effects of high-altitude ice to elaborate hoaxes. None could fully explain the combination of physical evidence, witness accounts, and the indisputable fact that Isaiah Monroe's body had been found in a location that hadn't existed when he died. The photograph showing Zay surrounded by the strange light became an iconic image in mountaineering circles. Despite exhaustive analysis using the most advanced technology available, no explanation for the phenomenon could be found. It wasn't lens flare, atmospheric distortion, or film damage. Whatever had surrounded Zay on that ledge had physically emitted light that registered on film. In climbing communities around the world, the Monroe Light became both legend and reality. Expeditions reported sightings less frequently after Zay's burial, but they didn't stop entirely. Climbers in distress, particularly those caught in sudden storms, continued to describe encounters with a figure surrounded by blue-white radiance who would appear briefly to guide them to safety before vanishing. For Lila, who had spent 15 years searching for answers, the discovery brought a complex form of closure. "I know now that he didn't suffer," she told an interviewer. "Whatever happened to my brother on that mountain, he went to it willingly, even joyfully." She established the Isaiah Monroe Foundation, which provided scholarships and equipment grants to young climbers of color. The organization's symbol, a stylized mountain peak surrounded by radiating light, became a familiar sight on expeditions around the world. The question that haunted many who knew his story, whether Zay had reached Everest's summit before his death, remained unanswered. His oxygen supply, found still largely intact with his body, suggested he might have made the attempt without supplemental oxygen, a feat that would have placed him among the most elite climbers in history. Others believed the summit had never been his true goal. His journal's focus on the mysterious light, which he had first reported seeing days before his disappearance, suggested he had been drawn to something beyond the conventional achievement of standing on the world's highest point. "My brother used to say that mountains aren't conquered, they're conversed with," Lila reflected on the 10th anniversary of his discovery. "I think Everest told him something that night, something meant only for him." Today, at certain mountaineering schools and in remote Sherpa villages, climbers still speak of Isaiah Monroe not as a victim of the mountain's harshness, but as something transcendent. Stories are told of a figure who appears during the most violent storms, surrounded by light that cuts through the darkest blizzard, guiding lost climbers back to safety. Scientists dismiss these accounts as hallucinations brought on by oxygen deprivation and extreme stress. The mind, they explain, creates familiar images during life-threatening situations. Yet the photograph remains unexplained. The body found in an impossible location remains a mystery. And on Everest's North Ridge, climbers still report a phenomenon they call the Monroe Light, a blue-white radiance that appears when hope seems lost, showing the way home. Was Isaiah Monroe simply a man who died pursuing an impossible dream? Or did he find something on that mountain in 1968? something that transformed him into more than memory, more than legend. Perhaps some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, lingering in our consciousness like the whisper of wind across Everest's eternal slopes. What remains undisputed is the legacy of a man who refused to accept the limitations others placed upon him, who climbed not just against the mountain, but against history itself. In Lila's words from the final page of her book, "My brother went to Everest to prove he belonged on the heights. What he found there proved he belonged to something even higher." If you believe some mysteries are better left unsolved, share this video with someone who appreciates a good enigma.